Research Forum South Africa and Spain, organized by the Society of Spanish Researchers in South Africa in collaboration with the Embassy of Spain in Pretoria. My name is Ainara Mancebo, Vice President of the Society of Spanish Researchers in South Africa. I will chair this plenary session about human and social dynamics, where South African and Spanish experts on these topics will present their contributions in a 15-minute format. During the presentations, you can use the Q&A platform to write down your questions that will be answered at the same platform. Before I hand over to our first speaker, I just want to note that this session is going to be recorded and shared in our YouTube channel. And now I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Carmen Martínez Vargas, postdoctoral research fellow in Higher Education and Human Development Research Program at the University of Free State. She will introduce her topic on epistemic governance and the colonial epistemic structure towards epistemic humility and transform South-North relations. Dr. Carmen?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ainara. It is a pleasure to be here today and to see many of my colleagues in South Africa and a Spanish colleague as well. Well, today I'm going to talk about the limits of epistemic governance in higher education towards North-South Epistemic humility. And I think this is quite relevant for today's forum, especially because we have a lot to discuss in terms of Spain and South Africa and how these relations are among the higher education system. So I hope towards the end we can talk, we can discuss about these ideas. I just wanted to mention that this is a paper that was published last year with my colleague, Professor Melanie Walker. So I will share at the end the papers in case you want to read it in full. Let me see. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to start talking, well, contextualizing epistemic governance, so we're all in the same page. Then I will say about the limits of the current analysis, and then I will propose a epistemic governance from a Southern perspective to later analyze some of the colonial challenges that we have currently in terms of epistemic justice and hermeneutical instruction, and then I will conclude with an agency-centric perspective of epistemic governance. So there are going to be a lot of things that I'm not going to be able to cover today, but I will be happy to discuss them later on because I'm going to have some assumptions about North, South, and so on. But because it's only 15 minutes, I prefer to draw on the argument more than going deeply into all the terminology, and later on we can discuss that if some of you have questions about that. In terms of epistemic governance, Campbell and Karagiannis talk about epistemic governance as the epistemic structure and knowledge paradigms that underline higher education. And Bedrod refers to it as the relations, the power relations in creating knowledge about socio-ecological issues, with particular reference to the interrelation of policymaking and scientific knowledge. So we see that their focus, and mostly the focus of the literature, is on organizations, institutions, and systems. But also there is a kind of normative underlying assumptions in terms of what it is good epistemic governance. And for that, Campbell and Karagiannis said that good, effective, and sustainable higher education is not possible when the underlying epistemic structure and knowledge paradigms of higher education are not being addressed. So what happened is, like, what we see in the literature is that when epistemic governance is referred to, it's mostly from a structural or systemic analysis. So this analysis says really little about what individuals and institutions can or cannot do, and is somehow overlooking the potential of agentic practices in preserving and promoting epistemic freedom. So we believe that this is a limited critical analysis of the epistemic structure, because it's telling half of the story, and it ignores coloniality and the corresponding and even playing fields in knowledge production in terms of North-South relations. So that's why in this paper, my colleague and I, Melanie Walker and I, proposed epistemic governance from a Southern perspective. And to do so, what we do is to focus epistemic governance on epistemic injustices in relation to the colonial epistemic system. So to do so, we use Fricker, testimonial, and hermeneutical epistemic injustices, but also Gotzi hermeneutic obstruction. I will show example of this when I go into how it works, the relationship between higher education institutions globally. But especially important for us is to bring the normative framework of the capability approach that somehow brings the individual to the forefront, highlighting the importance of agency, freedoms, but also the normative perspective of social justice. So this good, it has a substantive framework underlying what it is to be promoting social justice. So that's why we also use Endelope Gatseni with epistemic freedoms and Gotzi with epistemic humility. But to be a Southern perspective, we believe that the idea and the philosophy of Ubuntu is essential because it's not talking, because the capability approach has been criticized for being too individualistic and sometimes Eurocentric. So we believe that this has to be within the Ubuntu values, where we consider not only our individual freedoms, but the agency of every individual and the collective responsibilities with others' freedoms. So I will develop now this a bit more specific, bringing examples. But what I want you to know is that this paper was developed for critical studies in education, and we draw especially on literature from development studies. So you will see that the examples that we use is mostly from the field of development studies, although there are some areas that you will see that relate to many other fields in academia. So in terms of the epistemic structure of higher education globally, what we see that development studies is kind of maintaining and not necessarily dismantling global structures of dependency, including knowledge systems. And particularly remind us that development can be understood today as a new kind of imperialism. So it's a way of recolonizing again and again. And we see this because it's somehow promoting and maintaining this Western episteme. And as I said, we can discuss later on about this. But for instance, when we talk about collaborations, and this is going to be quite widespread among different fields in research, we see how this North-South collaboration masks a lot of epistemic problems, even exacerbate them in many cases. So for instance, we see how frequently the African scientists end up being the glorified field workers. These collaborations take the form of a boss-employee relationship. So it's not really acknowledging and valuing the importance of the work done and the difficulties in accessing certain fields and collecting reliable data, but as well, the role of Southern researchers most of the time is limited in the theorizing of this data as well. As we know as well, I don't know if many of you had experience, but certainly we did in my department, mobilities are problematic in many ways because of unfriendly visa regimes. So here O'Malley talk about an issue that a group of African researchers had to enter the UK for a workshop. And where Home Affairs in the UK said that on the balance of probability, we do not believe you're a researcher. But also we see that when invitations come to Global South researchers, they have to respond to North-term epistemic priorities as they seem instrumental to preset research agendas. So invitations are judged to be tokenistic because funders require the participation of researchers from particular regions, or the North-South relationship is seen as unchanged in that the North has the money and tries to dictate the research agenda. And somehow Africans are continually having to respond to someone else's agenda. So we see that there is an instrumental use of these collaborations because of requirements of funding institutions. But it's not only at the collaboration level and the relationship that we establish and the power structures that are embedded within those relations, but also in terms of knowledge production. So we see in publications, and this is quite problematic in development studies, because we can understand that there are some leading countries in some other fields, but in development studies, we assume that Global South scholars might be present. Only 3% of the surveyed journals by LKD in 2018 included authors from the Global South. So there is a dominance of UK and US authors in development studies journals, but also we know African scholars are underrepresented and or marginalized in or by the main global knowledge production centers, such as top-tier journals or key international conferences. But of course, this brings us to one of the main issues, that is, like, if we follow the money, we're going to find the epistemic injustice. And what happened is, like, global donors reproduce dependencies and constrain local decision making. So decolonial analysis can help in interrogating the epistemic power of global donors in their good intentions, their versions of development, and the discourse of the internationalization of higher education as an unequivocal good, who decides and whose agenda. Equally, in the South, there are one or two leading universities that are favored partners of the North, while the others are overlooked. And we can see that also at the country level when we see Africa, right? And in terms of how South Africa is situated in this landscape. And Southern researchers are exposed to everyday inequality and produce new knowledge and innovative ways of thinking out of the interaction of or lived material context and development and high degrees of poverty and inequality. So it's not only our positionality or careers as researchers displace as many of us, but also in South Africa. But we have to take into consideration that when researchers are lived in the place and they're exposed to the local conditions, the research is somehow contextualized to those conditions and align with the local agendas. That is something that global North researchers, when they come, take the data and live, is something that they cannot understand in a way. So we are missing that potential when we are not taking into consideration when Southern researchers are based and research in the Global South. And of course, because of these silences, we see that, especially in development studies, has been a striking epistemic silence about conditions of racism and its production of inequalities within contemporary development studies, including education and international development. And this is really problematic because, as I was mentioning, it's about whose agenda and who is telling, who decides what, right? And this is especially relevant for a context such as South Africa. So in this paper, what we do is we propose an agency-centered perspective to assist us towards a better evaluative space on how epistemic governance regimes are currently doing, but also how they can be improved prospectively. So the main point is to evaluate our research practices and our institutions in relation to whether or not people's epistemic agency is respected and people's epistemic freedoms expanded. And this is quite crucial because it has not been proposed yet. We do not welcome, we're not talking about epistemic charity as we see many times in these collaborations, right? And the instrumentalization of well-meaning collaborations, but rather about solidarity. And that's why we say that for epistemic governance from a Southern and capabilities perspective will entail the real opportunities that scholars in the South have to contribute to knowledge paradigms and epistemic materials as knowers beyond the Western epistemic system in a global community of scholars. So it will require agency on the part of Northern scholars to examine coloniality and their own location, their cognitive assumptions and their communicative practices, and actively to seek out, hear, and act in solidarity with Southern hermeneutical descent. So with this, what we mean is like aligned with those that are somehow helping to challenge these epistemic injustices. So Northern researchers for us need to challenge their own epistemologies of ignorance, their assumptions that we all enjoy the same level of epistemic freedoms, and their complicity in producing epistemic obstruction. And that's why we said that a way forward is to think about epistemic humility on the part of the agents, which require admitting the gaps in one's own interpretative tools. With this, what we mean is like understanding the limits of all epistemic communities and all researchers in the North and the South with our own interpretative tools, respecting those of others, but also understanding our own limitations. Sorry, I'm done, almost done. So that's why we think that Kelleher's proposal of personal or integral ethics is kind of helpful because it's understanding personal ethics grounded in recognizing that each of us must deliberately consider our particular actions and how we integrate our choices made in various spheres into the personal context of our individual lives. It's like being reflexive about who we are as researchers and how we are positioned in these spaces of power. So epistemic governance grounded in epistemic justice advances ethical agential skills in relation to research, thereby removing barriers and opening up a wider range of options from which people can choose. What matters is not only our own epistemic freedoms and agency, but that of others. And we think that this collective responsibility towards all those situated on the wrong side of the epistemic line is crucial, especially for Northern researchers. Sorry, I just had the 15 minutes to present a lot of ideas, so I hope we can discuss it. This is the paper I mentioned. And you can see it in Critical Studies in Education if you want to take a look, but I will be really happy to discuss any of these ideas later on at the end of all the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carmen, for your insights on this indeed important topic. Now, I'm very happy, please, to introduce our second speaker. He's Dr. Charne Lavery from WISER, Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at Wits University and the Department of English at the University of Pretoria. She will introduce her topic on Southern Oceanic Humanities between Spain and South Africa. Dr. Charne.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here and talking about what was a very productive research exchange for me. My talk is actually probably quite short, so that works well with the previous talk. And I've taken kind of a different approach. So rather than presenting one paper that has arisen out of my research as part of a kind of Spain-South Africa exchange, I wanted to talk about my research as a whole and give you a kind of overview, as well as the research of the project that I'm part of here, and then how that links with the group that I work with in Barcelona. So I hope that will be interesting. So I'm Charne Lavery. I'm based at the Department of English at the University of Pretoria, and I'm also 50% of my time is spent at WISA at Wits University in Johannesburg. My background is in English literature and the humanities more generally. So that's what the kind of discipline in which my work is based. So what does that have to do with the ocean and the global south is what I will explain now. So my research started with a doctoral research project on a strand of post-colonial literature in English. And this literature, rather than being set in the post-colonial nation of India or South Africa or Tanzania, was set in the Indian Ocean world. The Indian Ocean world, I'll explain. It brings together a set of novels that are about South-South connections between India, Africa, and the Arab world that are connected over very wide geographical space and over quite a long time, since at least the 3rd century. So the novels narratively embody, fill out, and perform what Amitav Ghosh, Indian writer Amitav Ghosh, calls xenophilia, the love of the other, or the affinity for strangers. The fiction establishes a world of centrality and agency, a distinctive set of literary precedents of mobility and exchange. The stories, for instance, are of Africans in India, or that's the Sidi communities constituting the so-called Black Indian Ocean, and Indians in Africa, linked by what Gaurav Desai calls the Afrasian Sea. My book on this topic is coming out actually next month. It explores the Indian Ocean world as it is produced by colonial as well as post-colonial fiction in English. And it focuses on the work of 3 contemporary authors who write the Indian Ocean as both a region and a world. So when we talk about the world of the novel is the Indian Ocean. So the 3 contemporary authors the book focuses on are Amitav Ghosh from India, Abdul Razak Gurna from Zanzibar in East Africa, who actually recently and rather luckily won the Nobel Prize, and Lindsay Collin, a Mauritian writer with origins actually in South Africa. And those writers are positioned alongside maritime imperial precursor Joseph Conrad. So if post-colonial literatures are sometimes read as national allegories, this book presents an account of a different and significant strand of post-colonial fiction whose geography, in contrast, is coastal and transoceanic. The work imaginatively links East Africa, South Asia, and the Arab world via this network of South-South connections that precedes and survives European imperialism. So they do provide quite a Southern view. The novels and stories provide a vivid, storied sense of place on both a local and an oceanic scale. And in so doing, remap the world itself as having its center not in Europe or the North, but in the ocean and in the South. That's sort of the basis of my work, and actually the basis of my connection with the Spanish exchange. But more widely, one ocean leads to another, and ultimately to what is called the world ocean. This is a map I very much like. It's the Spillhouse projection, which shows the world's various oceans as one body of water. And you can see Africa in the middle, and Australia, actually Australia more in the middle, and Africa from the left. So while I started in the Indian Ocean region, I've become interested in the close links between writing and the sea itself. And while the Indian Ocean really convenes a set of networks that delineate a world that's centered in the global south as a set of socio-political connections, because of climate change and rising seas, I have become interested in the materiality of seawater, water, ice, more generally, and the very long and close links between writing and water or the sea. So this is also the topic of a wider research project that I have, that I run along with Professor Isabel Hofmeyr, which is based at WISA. and that's called Oceanic Humanities for the Global South. I've just put a screenshot of our website on here. It's www.oceanichumanities.com. And the project is a subset of a wider interdisciplinary field known as the environmental humanities, which aims to bring environmental science and contemporary environmental crisis into conversation with the arts, history, literature, the humanities more generally. So there's been a number of different aspects to this project. One is decolonizing water in Southern Africa, and the idea of water. There are PhD students working on notions of the sacred in relation to water, the representations of water spirits in African literature, as well as those working on links between Caribbean deep ocean imaginaries and African imaginaries. We have one student working on the concept of Lemuria, or the sunken Atlantis in the Indian Ocean world, as well as a recent MA graduate who has done research on marine archaeological shipwrecks on the island of Mozambique. So it's a really diverse set of local students, as well as a network linking the Caribbean, Mauritius, and India and Mozambique. Okay, so we're also interested, as I said, in water more broadly, not just oceanics. For instance, we've recently published, I co-edited a volume of the Wasafiri Journal based in London. It's a journal of international contemporary writing, and it was on the theme of water. Together with Isabel Hoffman and Sarah Nuttall, we've recently edited a special issue of the Journal of Interventions called Reading for Water in Southern African Literature, which proposes a new set of critical methodologies in the discipline of literary studies. That journal is based in New York, so it's become a very wide-ranging project. We also have two local journals, special issues, so one in East African Literary and Critical Studies and English Studies in Africa. So there's that kind of North-South collaboration going on at the level of publications. So one further aspect of my oceanic interest is going further south. So while I was interested in literatures of the Indian Ocean and the ocean itself, I noted that the Indian Ocean is sometimes called the Ocean of the South, also the Ocean of the Future. But I was interested in its southern regions, so those actually bordering Australia and South Africa and Madagascar, as opposed to only considering kind of Egypt and India. And I became interested in these regions, so the not tropical, but the cold Indian Ocean, the Southern Indian Ocean, and also going further and further south towards the Southern Ocean and Antarctica. So the Southern Ocean is largely uninhabited and little known, and exemplifies the characteristics we associate with oceans in general. So as in this part of this role, looking at the kind of cultural history of Antarctica in relation to Africa, I now serve as Humanities and Social Sciences Delegate on the South African National Committee to the International Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, which has geopolitical power in the region. And I'm running a project on Antarctica, Africa, and the arts, which I am very interested in. If anyone is interested in related things from Spain, I would be fascinated to hear about them. Okay, and so briefly, this is the kind of work that has brought me into contact with colleagues in Spain, and particularly the that's just a map of the world. I wrote a paper on this focused on Antarctica, and that kind of distorts the north rather than the south. So the Ratnakarra Research Unit is based in Barcelona. It's an early, one of the few places in the world, along with the Center for Indian Studies in Africa, based at Wits, where I initially did my postdoc. And this is one of the other few places in the world which was looking at Indian Ocean literatures and cultures. So it was a research unit based in Barcelona at Autónoma University. And so while I was actually working as a lecturer at the University of Cape Town, I applied for an Erasmus Plus exchange to go and visit the Ratnakara research unit. So I spent a week there on a teaching exchange, teaching on the role of East African literature in the Indian Ocean region. And the following year, I returned for a conference on writing with a W, writing wrongs. I think this is the conference. And presented a paper on Amitov Ghosh's life writing of the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, which I left behind for a while, actually. This is many years ago, and I'm now returning to it and will present on that next week at a conference in Oxford. So the people I connected with were, and this is getting biographical, but you can see here, Professor Felicity Hand. She wrote probably the first book on Lindsay Collin, the Mauritian author that's a focus of one of the chapters of my book, and I relied heavily on her book. And her younger colleague, Esther Pujolras Nguer, she and Felicity were excellent hosts for me in Barcelona on both visits. And then Esther came to Cape Town and taught my classes in a seminar on Indian Ocean literature. Esther has moved from AUB to Lleida, and she and I have begun to establish a network that links the University of Lleida and the University of Pretoria, which is where I now work, also via Erasmus Plus. So that's all from me. Here's a picture of me via a submarine. That's it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chan, for your presentation and highlight the importance of collaboration between Spain and South Africa. Now, the last speaker for today is our fourth speaker. I will introduce you Dr. Susana Molins Lliteras, Associate Researcher at the Archive on Public Culture Research Initiative, Historical Studies Department and the University of Cape Town. She will introduce us her topic on iconic archive, Timbuktu and its manuscripts in public discourse. Dr. Susana?
Thank you very much, Ainara. Actually, it's a bit of a different title, but thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for having me. So today I'm going to be discussing Timbuktu and its manuscripts, archival fascination from South Africa to Spain. And I will give you some background on what I mean by that. So as some of you might know, in the last decade, we can say, I've argued elsewhere, that Timbuktu has become the iconic archive of written culture in Africa. So for a very long time, the word Timbuktu was associated with a faraway place, an unreachable place, almost a place of the imagination that didn't actually exist. But as we know, and as many researchers from Africa and elsewhere have tried to make apparent, Timbuktu was the hive of a very vibrant written culture in the so-called African medieval period in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. We can see that in the modern period, this really began to be researched and to be brought into light from the 1960s, really, from the period of the African decolonial movement, when we begin to see the African nations gaining independence in the 1960s, and with in particular with the UNESCO project of writing an African history, and historians and researchers from different African countries trying to write history with their own sources. So within this movement, we see that in 1967, the UNESCO proposed the creation of a regional resource and research center. And this finally came to fruition in 1973, when the Ahmed Baba Institute, which was then known as HEDRAB and now is known as the IGERIAB, opened in Timbuktu and began the prospection and the collection of manuscripts. And this collection of manuscripts was not only in Timbuktu itself or the wider region around Mali, but it was supposed to be a regional resource center, including manuscripts as far as Mauritania, northern Nigeria, Niger, Senegal, so really a regional resource center. And initially, the funding for this institute came from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And of course, afterwards, there was funding from UNESCO and from different European countries. Really, in the period that we see after the Mali underwent a period of dictatorship, and in the late 1990s, when the coming of democracy in Mali happened, we really see the explosion, or it has been called of private family libraries. So the Ahmed Baba Institute is the state repository, but of course there were many families that had large collections of manuscripts as well, and they were somehow reluctant to put those collections in the state repository. So from the 1990s, you see the beginning really of these family library collections that started in Timbuktu. And if you look at the table, we really see an explosion of this phenomenon. In 2008, there were about 21 of these collections, and by 2011, there were more than 408 family collections in the Timbuktu region. And of course, these collections varied in size. You have some big collections such as the Mama Haidara and the Fondokati, and others that were much smaller in size. So how does the South African intervention come into play? So as some of you recall, this comes in the period in the early 2000s with former President Thabo Mbeki, who really had this idea of what he called the African Renaissance. There's a lot been written about this African Renaissance discourse, but who really saw that the iconic value of Timbuktu, but for Africa's present needs. Former President Mbeki, when he was president, visited Mali on a formal visit in 2001, and he was taken up to Timbuktu by the then president of Mali. And one anecdote that is usually spoken about is that he was taken to see the manuscripts at the Ahmed Baba Institute, and he said, you know, I've studied at Oxford in some of the most prestigious universities in the world, and I never knew that in Africa we had such a legacy. So he committed to doing something to preserve this legacy. So the South African and the Malian government signed an intergovernmental agreement in 2002. And this project, the South African Mali Timbuktu Manuscripts Project, became an official South African presidential project. It was endorsed by the New Partnership for the African Development, NEPAD, as its first cultural project. And it was launched in 2003 on Africa Day in Johannesburg, and it was active until about 2009, more or less. And what is key here is it was really supposed to be an African partnership between two African states, a real sort of South-to-South collaboration. So what were some of the main aims of this project? Well, the first one is really the emphasis on conservation training. And there was the collaboration and training of Malian conservators by South African experts from the National Archives, both in Pretoria and in Timbuktu. And what is important here is that the conservation needs for the Timbuktu manuscripts were really developed with a sight on what were the actual characteristics of the Timbuktu manuscripts themselves. So as you can see in the image on the bottom, there are some particular characteristics of West African manuscripts as compared to manuscripts from other regions, even Arabic manuscripts from other regions. For example, the loose leaf format, they're not bound. So the conservation techniques were developed to really fit the purpose of these manuscripts in particular. There wasn't the importation of techniques from other regions, and also the resources and materials that could be easily available to be accessed in Mali. The other big part of the project was to build a new archive facility in Timbuktu for the Ahmed Baba Institute. And this was really a state-of-the-art facility that was built in Timbuktu, designed by South African architects and engineers, with the participation of Malian architects and engineers as well. And the product, as you can see in your screens, was this quite huge building, a state-of-the-art facility, which was inaugurated in 2009 by the presidents of Mali and South Africa. And the building itself contained a basement archive, which was able to preserve the manuscripts in all the conditions that were necessary. And in the upper rooms, it had conservation rooms, it had digitization rooms, research rooms, and of course also a public library, an amphitheater for other cultural activities in Timbuktu to take place. And the third aspect of the partnership was really an aim for research and public awareness. So one of the big outcomes of this was the traveling exhibition of 40 manuscripts from the Ahmad Baba Institute to South Africa in 2008, which was accompanied by the publication of a catalog. And this was a traveling exhibition that went to, I think, more than 6 South African cities, from Cape Town to Johannesburg to Durban to Bloemfontein, all over the country. And of course, the other aspect was a collaboration with our project at the University of Cape Town, the Timbuktu Manuscripts Project, in support of our research efforts, which include the research on the manuscripts themselves, the translation of manuscripts, and seminars. And our project is really based on the direct collaboration between ourselves and our Malian colleagues. And so we have many exchanges over the years of Malian colleagues coming to South Africa, us hosting seminars and conferences in Timbuktu as well. And of course, the publication of many different types of publications. So what about Spain? You might wonder, you know, as I've described, the idea between the South African intervention and collaboration in Timbuktu is really related to this idea of the indigenous knowledge of the African continent being brought to light and being brought to the public. So what about Spain, you might wonder? Well, if you look at sort of what happened with Timbuktu and Spain, you can see it's more or less in the same period as the beginning of the South African intervention. So the early 2000s, there was the so-called the discovery of the Fondo Cati, or one of these private family collections in Spain. And here on your screens, you see this manifesto that was published on one of the national newspapers, the ABC, which was the Manifesto for the Salvation of the Fondo Cati, which was signed by some very prominent personalities from the world of literature, from politics, saying that this is a huge discovery of this collection that can give light on Spanish history, on our own past, and we have to make efforts to save this collection. So what is this collection? So the so-called Fondo Cati, also known as the Andalusia Library of Timbuktu, is the purported library of Mahmoud Cati, who was one of the very well-known scholars from Timbuktu and the purported author of the 17th century chronicle, the Tarikh al-Fatash, which is one of the historical chronicles that are very crucial in recreating the history of the region, along with the Tarikh al-Sudan. And the director of the Fondo Cati, Ismail Dida de Haidara, was a purported descendant of Mahmoud Cati, and he had very strong links with Spain. And so when this collection was brought to light, he put forth several distinguishing features of this collection as opposed to other collections from Timbuktu. And those features were a unique genealogy linking his family to medieval Al-Andalus. But this genealogy, and the other one is the marginalia, or the marginal notes on the manuscripts, as proof of this connection. So what are these, what is this genealogical connection? What is interesting is that the claim was that the purported descendant of this family, Ali bin Ziyad al-Quti, came from Toledo in the 1400s and settled in the Bilad al-Sudan, which is the so-called the land of the blacks in the Niger Bend. And what is interesting is that the genealogical links are not with the Arab or Berber people that had settled on the continent during this previous periods, but so-called the original inhabitants of the Iberian Peninsula, the Goths, Al-Kuti, this name. And so Mahmud Kati, this famous scholar, was supposed then to have descended from this Ali bin Ziyad al-Kuti, but also from Songhai royalty, because Ali bin Ziyad would have married the sister of one of the Songhai rulers at the time. So Ismail managed to get funding for his library, but from the Junta de Andalusia, who funded the building of the Fondo Kati in 2003 and 2010 in Timbuktu. And really, you can see in this, we can really understand that this is a Spanish society that's trying to rediscover its own past. And somehow the Fondo Kati is a mirror for these aims. So not only was the Fondo Kati itself a focus of attention, but it really propelled the resurgence of interest in the relations between Al-Andalus and Timbuktu in different periods. So you can see here a huge number of publications that started coming up. You saw previously one with a provocative title, Los Otros Españoles. We see here Los Últimos Visigodos, the last Visigoths, the Library of Timbuktu. Then you see here Timbuktu, el reino de los renegados andaluces, Timbuktu, the kingdom of the Andalusi renegades, and so forth. And it's important here to point out that many of these titles were published by one particular publishing house, Almuzara, based in Andalusia, who is the brainchild of a former politician, Pimentel. And so really the sort of geopolitical interests in this are quite interesting, and I explore these elsewhere. Of course, as many of you might know, in 2012, in the late 2012, there was an insurgency in northern Mali, and the north of the country was occupied for about 10 months. And in 2013, early January 2013, the Malian army, with the help of the French armies, retook some of these areas. And in that moment, really saw again an explosion of publicity around the manuscripts of Timbuktu. There were these images of the manuscripts having supposedly been destroyed or burnt, and rumors and so on. In fact, what had happened was that this are images from the building that was funded by the South African government, the new building of the Ahmed Baba Institute. And some of those sort of terrifying images that you see of the ash and so on are in fact only images that don't represent a full reality. So the majority of the manuscripts were in fact kept, as you can see in the image in the bottom right, in the bottom in the archive, in the basement archive, and they were intact when the Malian forces came back into Timbuktu. It was only the manuscripts that were being kept in the upper rooms, in the digitization and in the conservation rooms, which had been dispersed. Some of them had basically disappeared, we believe probably stolen or sold for money. And some of the burning that you can see is mainly of the conservation boxes and not so much about from manuscripts. Although now the Ahmed Baba Institute estimates that of their collection of about 40,000 manuscripts, maybe 4,000 are still, their location is still unknown. But what happened to the rest of the manuscripts? Well, during the period of the occupation, there was a huge movement to move the manuscripts from Timbuktu to the capital Bamako, which is about 400 kilometers away. And this move was instigated by Abdelkader Haidara, who is the director of one of the big family collections, the Mama Haidara collection, but also the director of a NGO, Savama DCI. And so with Abdelkader Haidara, he initiated this move. The Fondo Kati, the one with the Spanish connection, Ismail also left Timbuktu during this period with a small number of manuscripts, and the rest he left in Timbuktu, although he took them out of the big library building funded by the Junta de Andalusia, and just took a number of manuscripts with him when he left. What's the situation now after this crisis? Well, there's, as I said, 33 private collections that are now in Bamako. And of course, the conditions in Bamako are completely different than the conditions in Timbuktu. The manuscripts are used to the weather in Timbuktu, which is dry and so on. And in Bamako, there's completely different climatic conditions. So there was a huge project to try to conserve, index, and catalog the manuscripts, funded by the German Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Henkel Foundation, the Prince Claus Foundation from the Netherlands, and coordinated by the Center for the Study of Manuscript Cultures from the University of Hamburg. There's digitization taking place, funded and led by the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library of St. John's University in Massachusetts, in Minnesota, from the USA. And some of the other libraries that had remained in Timbuktu are being funded by the Endangered Archives Program from the British Library. And what about the Fondokati? Well, the Fondokatis, as I explained, the manuscripts are still the majority in the Timbuktu. A small amount were transported to Bamako, but Ismail Didade Haidara, he has exiled himself to Spain. And during this period, he has really found new sponsors to raise funds for the Fondokati. This new sponsor is an insurance company, the DKV, and has really done many public events to get more publicity for the Fondokati. He received the gold gold medal from the city of Toledo in 2014, a very prestigious prize from the Círculo de Economía in Madrid in 2015, and has continuously been raising funds to conserve the collection. So just to finish off, I'd like to say that the librarians of Timbuktu have become almost the new monuments men, and there's been a huge amount written about this sort of process of smuggling manuscripts out, and you can see the different titles. There's been documentaries. There's been an Amazon Prime documentary on Ismail. So really, the manuscripts of Timbuktu have this iconic value that has really been able to capture the imagination from South Africa to Spain to the rest of the world. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Susana, for your inputs and highlight the importance of conservation of the Timbuktu manuscripts. We still have some minutes left, and I will open the floor to the speakers that would like to answer questions. We have one for Dr. Carmen from Professor Nico Orce. Carmen, you are there, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So the question of Nico is, what is your suggestion to break down the epistemic prejudice by high-impact journals, editors, and referees to accept articles from African institutions?
Thank you, Nico. That's a great question and something that we really need to address, especially for international, highly recognized international journals. There are some journals that are already busy having some measures to balance this. So they will be more flexible with submissions, flexible in the terms of the time of reviewing and so on. But of course, you know, there is no way of resolving the prejudices because that is implicit within the system. My personal suggestion will be to create some kind of training for reviewers and like a committee within journals, the editorial board, that is aware of these imbalances, and there is like a positive quota for certain collectives, as we have seen with other matters. But obviously, this is something that requires a structural and individual change. And I think that's why somehow the paper is highlighting like, well, you know, there is a lot of structural matters, but we can also start from individual change by yourselves. For instance, you know, when reviewing papers ourselves and when being part of this review committees or editorial boards from certain journals, to always raise these questions as a collective, so we can put in place measures as a journal to actually balance the not only the submission, but it's really challenging because obviously every journal has an agenda and has a specific they draw on a specific epistemic systems besides what we want to do, we want to challenge, right? So I think it's quite important to have open discussions within the editorial board about how to address in every and each journal, and we are part of that change. But of course, this is like a long-term issue, and we all need to contribute. I think probably it will be a good question to have also different journals meeting together to try to figure it out what will be the best options and the best long-term solutions that we can have in order to address this in a few years. I don't think that's going to be a thing that is going to be solved from one day to another. But thank you, Nico. That's a great question, and I think it's a question that we all need to think about. So it's not a question easy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carmen, for your answer. I don't know if somebody wants to raise the hand, has another questions. Okay, no. So this is the last minutes for now for this second session. We want to thank you to all the speakers for your inputs, and thank you to the audience for joining us today. I hope you enjoy it like we enjoy it. And also we hope that you remain in the platform for the next third session. Thank you very much, and bye.
Thank you.